Is the Brickyard 400 truly a crown jewel race in NASCAR? It's a very interesting debate that has sprung up on social media, and my take is so hot it's burned my beard off. So you're going to want to stay tuned and hear what I have to say because I come at it from a local perspective, right? I look at the Brickyard 400 a little bit differently than a lot of other people do because it takes place in my backyard. While you are down in the comments writing the comment, I know you're writing right now about this debate, be sure to hit the subscribe button. I always forget to remind people to do that, but subscribe to this channel if you want some more content. And obviously, it's Olympic break for most of us here in the U.S. motorsport world, so I will try to help fill that void. So this has been an interesting discussion online. Is the Brickyard 400 a crown jewel race? And I think there are very, very, very legitimate arguments in both directions. There are a lot of good reasons why it is and why the drivers love it and why they want to win the Brickyard, why NBC pays so much money for it, why the Indianapolis Motor Speedway sold as many tickets as they did yesterday versus the road course. The Brickyard does mean something. But at the same time, I can absolutely see and argue the point as to why the Brickyard 400 isn't a crown jewel race with NASCAR. And I can give you a very easy one right off of the bat. For a crown jewel race to truly be a crown jewel race of a championship, I would generally say that crown jewel race should probably be the biggest event that particular venue hosts all year long. And the Brickyard 400 does not check that box. Now, there was a time and a place at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway where they had to cut off ticket sales and not sell certain sections of the racetrack, particularly the infield, so that it would not be a bigger event than the Indianapolis 500 at the same track. But those days are long since past. So that's a good argument. But let's talk about why the Brickyard 400 still is a crown jewel race in the NASCAR Cup Series. And number one is the event I just mentioned. And it's kind of a contradiction to my previous point, but it's the Indianapolis 500. And the fact that outside of the Daytona 500 that takes place when most of the country is snowed in, nobody's got anything better to do, the Indianapolis 500 is the biggest race in this country. It's the most attended. It's the second highest TV rated race on television. It's one of the most prestigious in the world, worldwide. The Indianapolis 500 is a shadow that looms large over anything and everything that happens at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. The Brickyard 400 is something that at one time, as I mentioned, stepped out of that shadow, became its own thing, became huge, became a huge moneymaker. It bankrolled the CART IRL split and essentially caused IndyCar racing to fall into the pit that it is yet to crawl out of. And because of that, despite all of that, in fact, the Indy 500 has reached not all the way back up to where it once was, but it's getting very close. They're nearly selling out the race every single year. TV ratings continue to climb. Car counts are coming back up to where we want to see them for the Indianapolis 500. And all this time, the Brickyard 400 has been falling off significantly to a point where they decided to try the road course for a few years. Now, that didn't work out, and now we have the Brickyard back on the oval. And because of the shadow of the Indianapolis 500, the Brickyard 400 is the one time a year where NASCAR has little brother syndrome. And for them to not treat their Indianapolis race or act like their Indianapolis race is not every bit as important as the Indianapolis 500 would be an L for NASCAR. They have to do it because the Indy 500 is this massive outlier of NASCAR dominance in this country. Of course, Formula One would have something to say about that too, but that's a whole nother video. The other major point about why the Brickyard 400 is indeed a crown jewel race is that what this race meant to NASCAR. You know, you have to go to a time before I was born, but I have a lot of books, and I have a lot of good people like Brock Beard, NASCAR Man, making fantastic documentaries on NASCAR pre-1994. And NASCAR pre-1994 was very much a regional niche sport. Now, it was a regional niche sport that was growing significantly and was well on its way to the mainstream success that we saw in the late 90s and early 2000s. It would have likely achieved all of the things that it achieved without the Indianapolis 500. But the Indianapolis 500 and the Indianapolis Motor Speedway and the Brickyard 400 put a spotlight onto NASCAR that absolutely turbocharged. It was nitrous oxide to NASCAR's legitimacy as a not only a motorsport in the United States, but also to the broader sports landscape. That's why one of the first things that's said on the 1994 broadcast of the race is that NASCAR has arrived. NASCAR has grown up, said Paul Page. And that was the moment that NASCAR grew up and showed that it wasn't just a Southeastern sport. It could be a sport that could do well in the Midwest, do well out west in California and other places, Las Vegas. You saw the expansion across the late 90s and the early 2000s. Indianapolis was patient zero. It proved that there was a hunger and a desire for NASCAR outside of its core demographic. And so that race really changed a lot of things. I mean, I mentioned the Brock Beard and NASCAR Man documentary. As an IndyCar fan, it's like watching the Titanic head for the iceberg. You know what's coming next, and you just want to shut your eyes. But NASCAR understands how important this race was to them at one time, and to a certain extent still is. But here's why there is a debate. The problem with the Brickyard 400 is the problem that extends to all the other NASCAR races, save for the Daytona 500, and we'll talk about why that is even a question mark these days. But every race, to a certain extent, feels the same. I talked about this yesterday. The Brickyard 400 actually had an advantage this year. They had an extra practice day. They had a Friday practice. Next year, all expectations are that the Brickyard 400 is going to be a 2-day show. You qualify one day, you do a very small abbreviated practice, and then you're racing, and then you're getting the hell out of Dodge. That is not the recipe for a crown jewel race. The Daytona 500, even at this point, has been slashed and cut. One or two practice sessions, and that's it. The duels, I don't even think have any practice. I think they qualify before they actually have a practice session at the Daytona 500, which is lunacy to me. How can you build an auto racing event without actually having auto racing on the racetrack, even if it's just practice? The easiest promotional tool in the world is local people going, something's going on at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Let me Google this real quick and see what's going on. Duh. In 1994, and this is why it was so significant to NASCAR and so significant to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, the 94 Brickyard and subsequent Brickyards up until the mid-2000s were events, but especially 1994. IndyCar drivers entered the event. The Busch North Series the Busch West Series, the Winston West Series, was invited to come out, and they were given a provisional starting spot on the field. It led to a 90-car entry. You could have had a contingency race if you really wanted to, and they didn't. They probably should have. It would have been a cool tradition. But there was a ton of track time, a ton of testing. There was all sorts of media attention because of that. In 1994, the drivers were integrated into the community because there was so much time that they spent here building up and preparing for the event. There was even comparisons made to the IndyCar drivers at the time that the NASCAR drivers were better at promoting than the IndyCar drivers. The IndyCar drivers, as you know, and I don't know how true this is. Again, I didn't live the time. But the folks at the time said, well, IndyCar drivers have their noses up in the air and they're too good for the common folk. And that's not what NASCAR drivers are. And nowadays, I would say it has flip-flopped. The NASCAR drivers are the ones who fly in on private jets, go straight to Pat McAfee without even stopping at the racetrack, and then they leave the minute the race is over. So that's something that has changed culturally in NASCAR these days. The big issue right now I see with the Brickyard 400 and a lot of other races is that there's not enough buildup to NASCAR Cup events anymore. The media, and because of that, the media focus almost treats the NASCAR Cup Series like it's all one continuous event, not 36 individual events that the drivers are fighting to win. Therefore, most of the questions, most of the storylines have nothing to do with Indianapolis or the Brickyard or, what's going to happen at this specific race. We're talking about fights and we're talking about playoff implications. We're not talking about the event and who will win. And that kind of finds itself into the local Indiana media, because the local media around here, they didn't care about the race. The only thing they really cared about, because they had, and I'm taking a shot here, I understand, but the only thing they cared about, because I heard them ask the questions in the press conference, was talking about Caitlin Clark because she was on the hood of a backmarker car. So the local Indiana media doesn't see this as a big event because, to a certain extent, NASCAR doesn't treat it like a big event. Now, I need to really drive this point home. This is not an Indianapolis Motor Speedway problem. They did a great job. They promoted the event with what NASCAR gave them to the best of their ability. They focused on nostalgia. They focused on the importance of the Brickyard 400 and what it meant. And I think they benefited from it. I mean, I'm wearing some of the merch that they were selling in the gift shops. And I did a quick run through of the gift shops after the race. The Brickyard stuff was completely sold out. I mean, there was like one hat left. It was a great merch day for IMS. I'm told that there was, the number that keeps coming up is 70,000 people were there. And I would say, based on my eyeball, estimation of the crowd, the stands were about 25% full, which is, if you say there's 225,000 seats at Indianapolis, that gets you to about 63,000. I would say it was a little bit higher than that. I think the 70,000 number is absolutely right. So 70,000 people there is great for NASCAR, and it's something to build on at Indianapolis. So IMS did their part, but I think NASCAR has got to work and build this thing if they are going to promote it as a crown jewel. And to go back to the point I said about not focusing specifically on the race, think about the Indianapolis 500. That's the kind of racing that this local Indiana media and the local Indiana fans understand around here. The Indy 500, the championship grinds to a halt, and no one talks about points. Nobody barely even talks about beef that took place, 3 weeks before. Yes, Newgarden getting, a penalty for using push to pass at St. Pete was a big storyline coming in, but everybody forgot about it because once they got on the racetrack, it was about who was going fast on the days, who was going to qualify on the pole, who was going to get bumped from the field. These are the sorts of things that actually get talked about when you have racing or race cars on the racetrack. And that's what you need to build up a crown jewel event. You cannot have and promote a crown jewel event that is a 2-day show. It is impossible in racing. It doesn't exist. The only 2-day show is a 24-hour race, and they still have practice and qualifying, right? So that's the thing. I think this is something that NASCAR has to work on. They need more practice sessions. Although, the team owners, the Door Bumper Clear podcast goes, say, we don't need to practice. What are you talking about? Yes, you do. Even if you don't need the data, even if NASCAR goes, all right, we know exactly what the aero package is going to do. Who cares? It's free promotion. It's free promotion. Well, not free, but it's promotion. That's why you put race cars on the racetrack. And so that's, I think, what they need to do. And because of more race cars being on the racetrack and more things and storylines playing out, the media will focus less on the playoff implications and less on who's mad at who and who hates what. And it'll be more focused on, okay, this guy was fastest today. This guy was a little bit off. Can they work through the practice sessions and find something in their race car? We don't talk about those sort of things anymore in NASCAR. And I think that's part of why we have any kind of a debate about what's a crown jewel and what isn't. We need more stuff to talk about. And I think that if they have more practice days, that will also naturally lead to NASCAR drivers and personalities doing more local appearances, integrating themselves more into the community, and intriguing more folks to come out and buy a ticket to the race. So is the Brickyard 400 a crown jewel? Historically speaking, over the last 30 years, absolutely. I would say it absolutely is. It means a a hell of a lot, I'll tell you right now, to Kyle Larson and Hendrick Motorsports. I think it meant a lot to the fans that were there yesterday to see Kyle Larson win that race. It's kind of, I'll make this comparison. Imagine if the Bodine brothers or Ernie Irvan had won the first Brickyard and not Jeff Gordon. And I think that's the same thing with whether or not Brad Keselowski or Ryan Blaney versus Kyle Larson would have won the Brickyard 400 yesterday. Huge difference in height for next year's race. But I think to the average fan who is now used to NASCAR being a very much in and out sort of, see you next year sort of series, you don't see the buildup or interest in these events because NASCAR doesn't have a format that builds up a specific event. The event is the playoffs, and every other event is subservient to building up to that now. That's the problem. So is it a Crown Jewel event? Let me know down in the comments. I'm leaning towards yes.